what we're talking about is leadership transition. So church leadership transition, organizational leadership transition, and there's a lot to be learned about this, and I'm certainly not the expert. I've done it a couple times, and so I had to learn kind of on the job, and there were hard things, and I'll share a little bit about that. So hopefully we can find some transferable principles. One disclaimer, I'm coming obviously from an American context, and there may be some major differences in your organizations and the way they operate here in the UK in terms of oversight and hierarchy and other things that you have to pay attention to that I'm not familiar with. So hopefully I can learn from you on that as well. So let me tell you a tale of two transitions. I'm going to sketch this briefly. You can ask more questions later. But basically, my first senior pastor role was at a church in Washington State, and I was the successor to a 43-year tenured pastor. So he'd been in there his whole life, basically. He was basically the founding pastor. And I was 29 years old when I took my first, so I'm very green. I didn't know what I was doing. It was the first actual major leadership transition the church had ever been through in 43 years, okay? So primed for all kinds of difficulties, if you can think about that. And so I got in there, and then what happened, which was very interesting, is the church rapidly grew in the first couple years under new leadership. It was just fresh, and there was a lot of interest in the community. There was a major church nearby that had kind of an implosion, and a lot of those people came to our church. And so the church went from about 600 adults attending to almost 2,000 at special events, 1,300 or so week to week. And so the growth pains of an organization, if you think of it, that it grows that rapidly, they were severe. I had never led an organization through rapid acceleration and change, and so I made mistakes, and our team made mistakes, and all kinds of things. But we had in the United States, we say we have a tiger by the tail. It's sort of we're out of control. We're holding on for dear life, and that's how it felt. And there was a core of sort of people who had planted the church and grew very concerned with all the growth and all the changes that they were losing their church. And so they decided to try to control things and control me and control the board and kind of control the direction of things, which the board pushed back on, but then they got really upset. And so we went through some turmoil there as we kind of worked through that transition. So, okay, that's story one, okay? And we stuck it out for years and got to the other side of all the chaos, but we got beat up along the way, and it was kind of painful, okay? So then, fast forward, 2 years ago, I was invited to become the senior pastor at the Moody Church in Chicago, which you heard earlier has had 17 senior pastors, so multiple transitions. Pastor Erwin Lutzer was my predecessor, and he's still around, does radio ministry, writes books, all that kind of thing. But he had been the senior pastor for 36 years. And then there was an interim period. You may know the name Ed Stetzer. Ed Stetzer was the interim teaching pastor for a few years. But all in all, it was about a 5-year gap between when Pastor Lutzer retired and when I started. And I've been there for 2 years now, okay? So that's a little bit of the history. Everything's gone much better at Moody, by the way, than what I experienced in Washington. So anyway, that's sort of the field of play, and that's kind of what I'm speaking to you from, is from those experiences. So the first thing I want to address is why transitions matter. Why transitions matter. In a sense, we are all interim leaders. How many of you lead a church or an organization right now? You're a leader in your field, and there are people that look to you. Okay. In a sense, you are an interim leader, right? Someone will, if Jesus does not return, someone will replace you. And so it doesn't matter how long you're in position. In a sense, you are preparing in your current role for someone else beyond you. And true success requires a successor, right? True success ultimately requires a successor. What we believe and want for our organizations, our churches, is we want the mission to continue, right? The mission is more important than any individual. We exist here for God's glory, His church, and so we want to see the organization continue because it's about Him, right? And so the ultimate test of success is not what did you build for your season of leadership, but what have you passed on to a successor who can continue the work beyond you. That's the ultimate test of success. Because the kingdom is greater than our castle, right? The kingdom of God is greater than our little castle of what we might build for ourselves. And transitions are very important because they're crucial moments of vulnerability in the life cycle of a church. If you think about, if you had a heart transplant, right, in a body, you would, if you needed a heart transplant, you would go to the doctor and they would do all kinds of tests to make sure you're ready for that surgery. And then they would be very careful as they replace the organ to make sure they get it right. And then they would give you medicine, anti-rejection medicine, to make sure that the body, which needs the heart to survive, doesn't reject the very thing that will save it because it has different DNA than what it's being transplanted into. In many ways, that's what's happening in a leadership transition. There's a new heart being put inside an organism, but the DNA is different, right? And so DNA is going to shift and change, and the body can actually reject the organ transplant if you're not careful. And that happens a lot. And the reason this is so important, right, is you need stability. You need the identity of the organization to continue. You want the strategy of the organization to continue to play out. You want the momentum of the organization, the church, to continue. You don't want to interrupt those things. But that's all at risk in a transition, right? So that's why it's so important. Now, there's 4 basic succession models. And I'm going to draw them. The first one is an intentional overlap strategy. So if this is leader 1, I'm just going to do L1, and this is leader 2, right? There's a window of time where they're overlapping in the organizational life. So this is where you hire somebody and you say, hey, listen, we're bringing you into the organization. We're going to overlap for the next 2 years, 18 months. You're going to learn what I learn. I'm going to introduce you to all the right people. I'm going to pave the way so that you can take over leadership. So an intentional overlap strategy, okay? There's another strategy, which is what we could call the direct handoff strategy. So L1, L2. This is where there's actually no overlap, but you hire someone and you hand it off and there's no gap, okay? So this would be the seamless handoff. So this is like the baton pass at the Olympics where the runners are running, they have the baton, and they pass it off to the one behind and the one, or what is it? Yeah, it's in front, right? They pass it off and off it goes to the next one, and this one stops and this one starts. This is what I did in Washington. Okay, I showed up, my predecessor preached one week, I preached the next week, and off we went. Okay? Another model is what we would call the unintentional interim. Unintentional interim. So we create a gap between the leaders, but not on purpose. Okay? So this was not intentional. So this can happen when leader 1 has a heart attack and dies, and all of a sudden the organization has no leadership. What do we do? This can happen when a leader has a moral failing. We have to get rid of the leader. All of a sudden there's a gap. It can also happen if a church does not plan for the transition. and ends up in a surprise scenario where they end up leaderless without meaning to, but they end up, so maybe they wanted to do this and it didn't work out, this guy left. So they brought in someone thinking they might be the new leader. They get an offer from another church and they leave, and all of a sudden now we have a gap because we thought we had a plan and now we don't have a plan. Does that make sense? The fourth option, and I'm not going to draw it because it's exactly the same as this, except there's intention to it, actually I'll draw it just to make it easier, is an intentional interim strategy. Okay? And this is where you have this dynamic where you have a gap, but you intentionally create a little bit of a bridge. And you're intentionally saying, you know what, we need a break. There's things we need to do in the organization between this leader, and we are better served to have an intentional plan for a break. Now, I'm going to suggest that this and this are the best plans, and that both of these are bad. Okay? Sometimes you have to do this. This is always bad, I would suggest. Okay? Now, sometimes you end up there. You don't have control over the variables, and so you are there. But I'm going to suggest that this and this are our best options. Now, here's the big question. How much change is needed in the organization between the two leaders? That's the question. If there's not a lot of change needed, you go with this. So if the DNA is strong, the vision is strong, the momentum is strong, everything's dialed in and it's working really, really well, your best scenario is to get somebody who will overlap, who can really get this DNA cycled and infused between the two leaders, and then you have a handoff. So the stronger the organizational momentum, this is a good strategy, okay? Now, this can be an internal candidate. So this is where you're bringing someone along, you're mentoring them and building into them, and then they say, this is the guy, right? And then or this is the gal, and you invest in them. This could also be an external candidate, right? So this could be someone that you're watching from afar, and you say, I think that person could be our next leader, but maybe we mentor over Zoom or Skype, or we have conversation. We know where this is starting to go, and we have a trajectory for it. Even if they're outside the organization, we're making these plans to see this DNA transferred. Does that make sense? If there's a lot of change needed in the organization, let's say you have some toxic individuals on staff in key roles, and they need to be transitioned out. Or let's say the ministry used to be really thriving, but it's gotten tired. And some of the strategy needs to be rethought, revamped. Creating separation allows you space to start to do that. Does that make sense? Because you don't want to transfer all the DNA. Because part of the DNA is the problem. And so so this is a continuity strategy. This is a discontinuity strategy. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes?
Who leads the strategic thinking if there's no leader?
So a lot of organizations have like a board of elders or board of trustees or something like that. If you have a denomination, there may be a denominational voice in that conversation.
If it's top of the denomination?
If it's all the way at the top of the denomination, does the denomination have a board?
Yes.
Okay, so then the board would be, and maybe the senior leadership team might be involved as well, depending on how the structure works and how much they have voice in it. But yeah, there is this by definition, if you have a bridge, someone has to build a bridge, right? And it's not going to be this person, and it's not going to be this person. So you have to have a board doing this, okay? Good question. Now, as you ask these questions, I can't give you all the variables. In the notes, first page, near the bottom, I have indicators of organizational health, okay? So these are areas that you need to probe as you try to determine how much continuity and how much discontinuity you need to pursue during the transition. So you need to think about the history of the church, what is your story, the precedent of transitions, how transitions happened, What are the patterns that are happening in the organization? In terms of culture and things like that. Governance, you need to think about governance and bylaws, policies. How healthy is your board? Finances, are you financially healthy? Are the trends moving in good directions or bad directions? Do you have any debt you need to think about managing, and risk tolerances you need to mitigate? You need to think about the generosity of your church, your people that are funding the organization, because if you're barely making budget, this strategy is going to create a hiccup for you. People have a hard time giving to organizations when they don't know who the leader is, right? So if you're financially tight, you may have to go with something more like these two, because you can't afford a gap. Does that make sense? Because you might have a dip in giving during the interim. You don't know that, but those are things to be thinking about. Your facilities, are there, how's your facility doing? If you're multi-campus, your sites and their health, their viability, deferred maintenance on your facility and assets, and like how much of that's laying in the background, all of that impacts your financial positioning. You want to be thinking about your programs. Are they effective? Are they reaching the community? Are they stalled out? Are they gaining traction? You want to think about your team. Do you have the right people on the bus? Are they in the right roles? Do you need to reorganize? These are all the right questions. I'm not giving you any answers. I'm just saying these are the kinds of things you need to think about. Your church culture, their beliefs, attitudes, values, behaviors. Are things healthy? Again, if you have a lot of work to do, you can pursue something like this. If everything's really going well, something more like this might be something to consider. Okay? Now, let me make this more complicated. Okay? Let's talk about organizational life cycle. You're familiar, I'm sure, with that organizations kind of live on a like a bell curve. And so let's just use church language. Let's say you're planting a church is down here, right? So this is where you're getting started. Then you go through a growth phase. So we can call this like accelerated growth, where you have rapid growth. Then you get to, what did I call this? Sustaining growth, okay? Sustained growth. This is, we planted it, we're just getting started. It's starting to grow, people are coming. We're keeping it going at its current level. It's not growing much, but we're sustaining it. Then you can go through, it can peak, and you can start to get tired and go into a slight decline. And so this becomes revitalization effort, where you need to revitalize the church. Then you can keep going down. So now we're in free fall a little bit. It's really tired. The church used to be big. Now it's kind of tired and falling apart. This is a turnaround. And then you can get something that looks very close to this, like it's barely getting by, and this is a crisis. Knowing where your church is in the life cycle of its growth pattern is really important, because it tells you what kind of leader you need for this next season. Does that make sense? If you're in an accelerating growth phase, that's a totally different kind of leadership than crisis leadership, which is totally different than turnaround leadership, which is very different than sustaining growth leadership. And different leaders are wired with certain gifts that are more appropriate. Not everyone can do all of this equally well. Some people are just so good at this. They have idea after idea, and they can chase it, and then as long as the momentum's there, they just keep pounding after it, and it's amazing. But if you take that leadership and put it in a turnaround situation, drive everybody nuts. Because this is slow and steady, bringing people along, collaborative, getting stuff turned around, helping a people dream again, figuring out. You see what I'm saying? It's a totally different skill set. So this is very important. What you're trying to do in all of this is you're trying to match the successor to the situation that you're in, and you're also trying to map your strategy to the situation as well. So you have a situation, and you need a strategy that fits your situation, and you need a successor that's going to fit the situation too. So that's your formula. Find the right successor, measure your situation, your strategy to the specific situation, and if you can get that together, then you have at least a good plan. Now, let me make it a little bit more complicated. Now we're going to talk about navigating the vulnerability window. In transitions, okay, I'm gonna draw this one way, and then we're going to draw it for each of the 4 scenarios I gave you earlier, okay, for the 4 models. But first, let's get the concept. If you have like an XY graph, okay, and this is trust, and this is time, okay? And so we have a scale of levels of trust, and we have time going out this way. Okay? There, in a transition, you have a leader that's exiting, and as they exit, let's put them here because they're not Jesus. Jesus would be up here, okay? But let's put them here. Let's say this is the amount of trust they've garnered over a lifetime of leading, or 20 years of leading. They've been in position for a long time. They have a lot of trust, and they say, I'm leaving. I'm retiring. I'm going to move somewhere, and I'm going to enjoy my grandkids or whatever, right? So, but people don't forget that leader right away, do they? They still revere, they still trust, they still admire, they still feel connected. And so that the erosion of that trust, the trust that they have in that leader, does not go away right away. So it does something like this over time. The trust starts declining. Okay? Does that make sense? Not that they did anything wrong, it's just they're not around, they're not leading. Once they announce they're leaving, let's say that this is where they announce they're leaving. Okay? This is the point. Okay, so then it starts just tapering. The board becomes the thing that people start looking to. The elders, the organizational leadership. What are we doing? This leader's leaving. What are we going to do? So there's another curve in here, which it's been here all along. But let's say the organizational trust is close. Okay, it's about the same level. And it becomes kind of a bridge. Okay, to kind of cover the gap. Then you have a new leader that's coming in. And that new leader is hired at a date after the succession, right? So let's say that starts here. Now, they don't start at 0. They get imputed trust because they were chosen by the church. Or this leader maybe says, this is the next person to lead our organization into the future. And well, if they say so, then I believe them, right? I don't know who they are yet. But I believe them at some level. So they don't start at 0. They start somewhere like here. And then they start building trust over time. And so what you end up with are all these critical intersection points as these lines come together. And we're going to walk through them in each of the scenarios, and I'm going to explain why the scenarios work different ways. But every one of these moments of intersection are crucial. And you can feel them in an organization as you transition between these things. Let's talk about what that looks like. Okay? All right. So, if you have an intentional overlap strategy, okay? So this is your strategy, right? L1, L2, and you have this like window of overlap, right? If you have that scenario, what you have is you have a leader whose line looks like this, right? Something like that. So we're using that same graph, but I'm not going to draw the lines, okay? So they have a lot of equity, and then it's going to come down. Your incoming leader starts here, and we'll just put them up here so it's easy to see. And they come up like that and keep going, right? So your inflection points are right here when you bring that person into the organization. You have this handoff actually the handoff is going to hold on, let me draw this out this way. Let's say this is your handoff right here. Let's say the leadership is handed. So this person's been in the organization for a while, and they're learning from the previous leader, and then there's a handoff that occurs here as this person assumes leadership. And there's a period of time where people are learning to trust the new leader, and the old leader is in decline, and then there's an inflection point where the equity of leadership transfers to this new individual, and they take it off, right? And then if this one continues to go down until it's basically gone. So in this scenario, your key inflection points are here, here, and here. Okay? When you bring someone in, it's a big moment. When the new person's equity has more influence than the old person's equity, the former person, this is huge, because you will hear people say, I really like that old person, the former leader, and I just don't know about this new person. And if they don't make a transfer of trust to the new individual, they keep riding down this slope. And there's nowhere to go but down to the very bottom. They will get more and more and more and more and more and more and more frustrated as this person continues to gain influence in the organization, and they realize it's never going to be the way it used to be. That's unless they transfer trust from the old leader to the new one, they're going to be miserable. And then they basically have to leave the church or leave the organization. You'll have employees do this that just can't make it. And this is part of the dynamic. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's scenario one. If we do a direct handoff, so L1 and L2, and these are just seamless. What you're doing is spreading these things out. So the curve is exactly the same, but instead of there being a lot of overlap, you're bringing in the person later, and they have to climb like this, right? And so the transition happens right here, which means there's no season for people to get to know the leader before they realize the transition's happening. So they just start from scratch, and they have to just ramp hard. And so what you'll notice that the gap here, there's a trust deficit right here that's actually bigger than here. Because you've spread these over each other, the hiccup here is smaller. But because we do it, because we're compressing it, we're doing the handoff, this amplitude is just bigger. Okay? And that little valley is hard on an organization. That's why this is easier on an organization than this is. Does that make sense? We tracking? Okay. Now, I wish I could have all these on one sheet. I'm running out of space. Let's say you have an unintentional interim. Okay? In this case, the exiting leader still has the same curve. If it's a moral failure or someone had to be fired or whatever, it can drop really fast, right? It would just be like, the trust line would just tank. But let's assume it's not a moral failure. Let's just say it's just something else. But there's just not a good plan. This leader still has this curve. And we don't really find a new leader until here. And there's a huge valley of trust in this scenario, right? What's going on? Who's in charge? I don't know which way it's going. So what happens is the board, your board is the bridge. And the board kind of smooths this over. People stop looking from this leader, they start looking to the board, and then they start looking to the new leader. Does that make sense? And so you end up with all of these inflection points of this is when the former leader is leaving, this is when their equity tips, and the board is now in charge. You're hiring a new person. This person's equity is still eclipsing and intersects here. The board has to then transition to the new leader, which is here. So you have way more inflection points in this kind of a scenario. Okay, now let's talk about an intentional interim. And in an intentional interim strategy, there's our bridge. You have something that looks a little bit more like this. You've got the leader that's leaving. You've got the leader, you've got the board. The board says, we're not going to have a new leader right away. We're going to take a season to pray. We're going to make some changes that we need to. And so the board takes over. And they may have some rocky time in here, but they act as the bridge. And then the new leader can come in and take over. And so what you're doing here, if you choose the intentional interim, if you realize what you're really doing, you're creating two transitions, not one. You're actually separating the transition into two smaller transitions. The transition from the former leader to the board, and then from the board to the new leader. And so this acts as an interim. Now you could hire an interim pastor to do this. You can do this as a board and have a teaching team or something like that. The reason this is choppy, though, is you're probably making some organizational changes that you need to, and not everyone's going to like all of that. But you're taking the hits so the new leader doesn't have to do it. They get a clean ride just coming out. Does that make sense? So you really have two transitions here and here, rather than just one. So you spread it out. Am I creating confusion or clarity? Okay. Here's the point. This is the reason I do all of this. You will feel, in an organization, you will feel angst at all of those tipping points. People won't know who's in charge. They won't trust leadership. They'll gossip. They'll talk to their friends about, I don't know about this. This is Moses in the wilderness and grumbling and complaining because they had a transition. They weren't straight from Egypt to the promised land. They had an interim, and so they didn't like all of that. And so whenever you're in these transitions, you will feel the dynamics as you go through it. And wherever these lines are crossing, there will be little rumbles. They can be small, medium or large rumbles, but they will be there. On average, what I've read is that, let's go back to the basic, well, depending on the scenario, okay? The timetable, this is the most extended time scale with the intentional bridge. So at Moody Church, this was 5 years. 5 years. Now, here's what's interesting. They've done some research, and they have found that for every year that a senior leader has been in place, the recommended interim time is 1 month. So Erwin Lutzer was in a pastor for 36 years. So that's 3 years of interim if you follow that rule. So it depends on who you ask. But we had 5, and I would say that's a gift to my leadership in that role. Because what happens if you come in, if you do the direct handoff, if you do the baton pass, right? Let's say Moody Church. So Erwin Lutzer hands the baton to me and I run with it. What do we hear every single week when that happens? A comparison. You're just immediately compared to the previous leader. Good, bad, or indifferent. It's every week. Well, was it as good as it was before, right? When you have 5 years of interim, you get a whole lot less of that. It still happens, but you get a lot less of it. Because people are just relieved to have somebody at some point. You know what I mean? Because what you have to do, if you think about it, you're detaching from one individual and you're reattaching to another one. And when you detach, it triggers grief. Grief. What's grief? Think about what's grief? Denial. This isn't really happening. Erwin Lutzer's not retiring. I've only had one pastor. I can't have another pastor. This can't be happening, right? Anger, bargaining, depression. That's the cycle of grief, right? And finally, acceptance. So what happens is when you're detaching from a leader, you go through grief cycles. And you're bargaining, trying to have it your way. You're angry because it's not the way it used to be, and you don't like the new thing. You're in denial that it's even happening, and I'm just ignoring this. Then you go through depression. Oh, it's just not the same. But if you get to acceptance, you can reattach and go forward. But that grieving process has to happen. And if you don't create space for it, it'll happen during the transition. If you create a separation, you can let the grief happen before this transition happens. Because here's the thing. What do you do when you're angry and you're depressed and you're not feeling great? You want to blame someone, right? For what you're going through. Who's the easiest person to blame in a leadership transition when you're grieving the loss of the former leader? Who's the easiest person to blame? The new guy. It must be their fault, right? That's the visible change in the organization. I'm not happy. It must be their fault. So what happens is by doing this as a board, you're saying we're willing to take some of the shots that are going to come with the grief. We're going to take them. And then we're going to give this person a clean start. So you allow people to actually detach so they can reattach, and it doesn't get put on this person's shoulders. In the first scenario, this one, the overlap, the person who's pastoring the people through grief is whom? When you have an overlap like this, who is pastoring people through the grieving process of the change? The former leader. They are taking the grieving process. They're taking the church or the organization through the grieving process. It's going to be okay. I know you don't want to think about it, but I really need to retire. I've been praying about this, thinking about it. I know, listen, it's going to be okay. You know why? Because I've handpicked this person, and I really believe this is the person that God has for this organization, and you're going to be just fine. You're going to be just fine. And so this person is actually leading the grief process on behalf of this incoming leader. Powerful, huge gift. If these people can do that together, huge, right? Okay. So let me give you some final practical takeaways, and then I want to open it up for questions, okay? I put all of these in your notes, okay? So I'm going to rattle them off quickly. Takeaways for outgoing leaders. Number one, initiate the conversation with your board 5 years out. 5 years. Oh, that sounds like forever. I know. But you know what? It's going to take your board 1.5 years to grieve the thought of you leaving. And then they're going to have to make a plan. And that's going to take them a couple years. And then you're going to have to work the plan. And that's going to take a couple years. So 5 years is what you need to do. Now, here's the thing. That requires a certain security in your role as a leader to be able to say out loud, hey, guys, we need to get ready for this. I want to do this successfully. It's very important. There's no success without a successor. Kingdom's greater than my castle. I need you to help me lead well over the next 5 years. Let's do this together. They may try to talk you out of it. You've got more gas in the tank. I know you can do it. Listen, that's the conversation you need to have, though. Okay? 5 years out. The next thing is to seek the Lord as to what your future will be, what your future ministry will be. The worst thing in the world is to go from serving the Lord every day with every ounce of your energy to nothing. This is a terrible plan. You'll go crazy, and you'll start to meddle in things that you have no business meddling in. So you need to get yourself a hobby that's going to take your time and energy and interest and passion. And that might be ministry. It might be something else. It might be your grandkids. It might be painting or something else you want to pick up. But you need something other than sitting around and thinking about, if I were still there, this is how I would be doing that. That's not helpful to you. It's not helpful to your successor. Like, that'll take you down a bad road. You need a hobby, something that's going to pull your heart. And I'm convinced that, retirement is not really a biblical concept. So, we're going to serve the Lord all of our days. So, figure out what that's going to look like. And you got to have a plan for that. Another principle is entrusting your ministry to the Lord and to the board. Entrusting your ministry to the Lord and to the board. It's not yours anymore. It belongs to the board, the overseers of the organization, whoever's in charge. Don't entrust it to your successor. In your mind, you've got to give it to the board, to the final authorities in the organization. Because if you have a concern about the ministry at any point, you cannot bother your successor with that. You bring that to the board. You bring your concerns to the board, because your successor doesn't need to be dealing with your feedback on a regular basis of how things are going or how he should be improving or how she should be improving. Does that make sense? It's not helpful for anybody. If you have legitimate concerns, they go to the board. It's their job to lead the leader of the organization. Let them lead them. Trust that to the Lord. Give it up. Release it. Releasing control, expectations, and ownership. This is the key. Open hands. Right? It's so hard. I don't even know how I'm going to do it. I'm raising little girls right now. I've got 3 little girls. I've got a son. I don't know what it's going to be like to hand my daughters off in marriage. I don't even want to think about it. But that's what you're doing with your church or your ministry or your organization. It's like your baby, and you're handing them off. And at that moment, that relationship is permanently changed. And you've got to entrust it. You've got to release it. It's not going to ever be the same, which brings its own grief that you have to recognize. That's what you're feeling. You're going to feel your own grief, denial, bargaining, anger, depression. You're going to go through all of that. Speak blessing over your successor always. Speak blessing over your successor always. Be a raving fan. Don't criticize. People will pick up any angst they feel from you, any criticism they hear from you. They will pick it up, and they will drive it like a wedge between you and your successor faster than you can believe. If you even show a hint of displeasure at anything going on, it will create problems for your successor. This takes massive character. Direct your concerns to the board only. We said that. And this is so hard, but I want to just say it. If you can't do this, what we're talking about, managing yourself, creating a hobby, not criticizing, filtering your comments only to the board, if you can't do that, if you just know I'm going to talk to my friends about things, then you need to leave. You just need to leave. Move to a different state, a different country, go somewhere else. You can't stay around if you know you can't be trusted to not meddle in the organization. It takes huge character to commit to this kind of leadership. It's the final test. Okay? All right, so that's if you're the outgoing leader. If you're the incoming leader, number one, honor the past. Honor the past. You stand on shoulders of giants. Speak well of them. As you lead change into the future, you don't have to tear down the past to build a future. So important. Even if you're changing something, you don't like it. Who built this? What were they thinking? Don't say it out loud. People love that. That's why they come, Don't tear it down, because if you tear it down, you're criticizing somebody who built that, right? So you honor it. You say, hey, we've been doing a really good job with this. We're going to take it to the next level. Honor the past, build to the future. Don't tear down the past to go forward. Steward the DNA of your organization. Every good mission-driven organization has in its origin story a beautiful DNA of mission. It may have lost it. It may be tired. It may not be sharp like it used to be. But every great mission has a beautiful God story at its origin. Figure out that story and tell that story. This is who we are. This is who we are. Because everywhere you're going is rooted in your past if you use your DNA that way. Does that make sense? So when you want to have a new initiative, you say, you know what? So let me just give you an example. Let's say we want to do an outreach at Moody Church, and it's going to be in the inner city or something like that. And I'd say, you know what? D.L. Moody used to get on a pony, and he'd ride through what they called Little Hell in Chicago. And there were street kids, and he would throw candy at them, and he'd preach the gospel. That's our founder. And so you know what we're going to do? On Saturday, we're going to go out into the park, and we're going to have this, and we're going to do... But now I've anchored our future endeavors in the past, in our story. Does that make sense? It's powerful leadership if you're a successor. Guard against comparisons. Guard against comparisons. You are not your predecessor, and your predecessor is not going to be you, and that's okay. You're the person God has in the role. People will love that predecessor, and it takes nothing away from who you are. Don't get jealous. Don't compare. It's irrelevant. It takes a huge amount of emotional management. I expect I will hear Erwin Lutzer's name until the day I die. And that's good. That should not bother me. Does that make sense? If it bothers me, I can't do this kind of work. I've got to manage my heart. So guard against comparisons. Build trust through relationships. The best thing you can do as an incoming leader is to build trust through relationships, relational touch, relational connection. The more relational building you can do to build trust and credibility, the better. You will need allies because these inflection points are all coming, right? And so you need people who know you, who love you, and are committed to you, because you're going to need people to back you when these things happen, when the churning happens. You've got people that need to go out there, and they're going to say, I know him, or I know her, and I know her heart, and you need to just calm down a little bit and give this some time. Because they're going to use their equity to help you, and you need those people. So build them. Day one, start building those relationships, because you're going to need them. Make sure you stay in sync with your board. Oh, this is so important. Especially if you're a young leader and you want to prove yourself, or you really, you feel like you got to make your mark. This is really important. Stay in sync with your board. They will always make you move slower than you feel like moving. Listen to them. Stay in sync with your board. There's no sense in running out ahead and making your board clean up your mess behind you. That only works for so long. Stay in sync with your board, even if it means going slowly. Be patient. Be patient. The work that your predecessor built took him a lifetime to build, probably, and you're not going to get anywhere close to that kind of impact for many, many years. So just be patient. Play the long game. Don't be crazy. Know how much equity you have. Does this word translate across the continent, equity? It's like cash in the bank. As a leader, you trust is like people give you, when they trust you, they give you like a little bit of money, right? They give you a little bit of trust, okay? And then when you lead change, you spend some of that. So you have $100, and let's say you decide, hey, we're going to make this change to the organization. Well, some people aren't going to like it, so you spend out $20. Then you make another change, you spend out another $20, right? Well, what you can't do is get to zero, okay? Because then you have no money. You're out of equity. You've used up the trust that you've built, and this is a real dynamic. But if you spend $20 on a change and it works and you get $40 back, that was an investment, and now you've added to your trust bank, right? But if you spend it and it doesn't go well, you just spent it. It's gone. And so over time, by the time you've led for a lifetime, you have an enormous amount of equity, like to the point where you can almost not fail. Like you can make a really dumb decision and people will be like, you know what, but he's been great for 20 years. Give him a break, right? But if you're new and you're in your first couple years, you don't have that. So you got to steward that well. Know how much equity you have. It's a very soft thing. You can't measure it, but it's there. Another thing is become an expert in grief. Learn what grief feels like, how it talks, how people speak when they're grieving, because you're going to be leading a lot of people through grieving. That's what change management is. It's grief management. And so learn how to work with grieving people. If you're a pastoral person, this is not that hard, but it gets hard when you have your own leadership that's baked into your pastoral care as well, because they're actually mad at you. Right? Or they think they're mad at you, and they're really just mad about the transition, but they think it's you, and you still have to try to lead them. It takes a certain amount of art. So become an expert on grief. Enjoy the honeymoon, but don't trust it. It won't last. Do you know this term honeymoon, leadership-wise? So the honeymoon is when, the first few months when everyone's just so, yay, we love you, Pastor. We love you. You're the best thing ever. And everyone brings all their expectations for all the things that have been frustrating them for the last 10 years. This person will fix them. Oh, I'm so glad you're here. I've been meaning to tell you, we love you, we love this, but these things need to change. And you can't fix everyone's problem, and you can't change everything. And then after a while, 6 months later, people realize you're not Jesus. And you're never going to be Jesus. And then they have this moment of like, oh no. And then they start, can I have an appointment? I have a concern, and it starts. And then you're out of the honeymoon, okay? But here's the point. You'll have a honeymoon, but it'll feel great, but it's not real. Don't trust it, okay? Just because it'll go away. It'll go away, and it's a fake thing. Okay, last thing, expect sabotage and plan to outlast it. Expect sabotage. As these inflection points hit, there will be groups of people who decide you're the worst person in the whole world and they can't stand you, and they're going to make a little fit about it, and then they're going to leave, and they're going to bring their friends, and they're going to talk bad about you behind your back, and it's all going to happen. You can't change it. Sabotage is going to happen. And it's not you. This is really important. It's not you. And you're not a bad leader if people are sabotaging you. It means you're actually getting stuff done. So expect it and plan to outlast it. Put on your big boy pants, your big girl pants, and get through it. And lean on the people around you and your board, and because you're going to need it. Does that make sense? But you got to outlast it. If you jump as soon as it gets hard, don't sign up for this. Okay? Okay, last things real quickly. If you're a board member, If you're a board member, so you're going to be on a board and you're going to be helping an organization think about or plan for or navigate a transition. Number one, do your organizational homework. Do the hard work of figuring out what model is going to make sense for your organization and what are the vulnerabilities and risk management that you need to be considering as you go into this window of vulnerability. There's lots of things you can do to shore things up and stabilize things during a transition window. So the earlier you can get at that, the better. Choose your transition model carefully based off of what's going to fit the parameters of what you need in your organization. Don't be afraid to go slow and work the plan. Everybody in the organization wants an answer to who the new leader is going to be right away. If you choose an intentional interim strategy, people won't like this. They want something more like this or this. But if you go with this route, and there's a lot of wisdom to this route, you explain it, but people will go, I don't think we need 3 years between Erwin Lutzer and whoever comes next. That seems like forever, right? 3 years? Are you kidding me? That's nuts. 3 years without a pastor? So, but you got to just stick to your guns if you know what you're doing. Here's what often happens. That interim is usually, sometimes it's an unintentional interim. There's a lot of churches that when their pastor retires, they don't actually have a plan. It takes them 6 months to get a search committee together. They kind of take 3 or 4 months to put together a profile, and they start the search, and then that takes a few months, and you end up with a long window anyway, just through poor planning, right? Like not having a plan. You'd much rather have a plan that includes like, hey, we're going to take 3 months. And we're going to talk as a congregation about what we really want in our new pastor. And we're going to talk about what we really loved about our former pastor. And we're going to talk about what we need in a new pastor. And then we're going to take 3 months as a church. And we're going to pray. And we're going to formulate a job description. And then we're going to start searching. And we're going to take 3 months to collect resumes. And then we're going to go through those. And so it's not like you're doing nothing. But you can create a plan that has an intentional window of time that allows people to detach, grieve, process, be a part of the solution. I mean, so you could create something that has some separation. You may not want to say out loud it's going to take 3 years, but yeah, there's wisdom. Sometimes if you need a break, there's wisdom in creating it, even if it's hard. Yeah, people want to snap to a solution, right? It's like people get divorced and then they if somebody gets divorced and the next month they're dating, you're like, what? No, don't do that, right? Because you need to grieve, you need to process, you need to heal, you need to work on yourself a little bit, and then maybe you see what I'm saying. We instinctively see it in those scenarios and go, that's not healthy. But in organizations, we can snap to a solution that actually isn't good for us. Lead the congregation through a grieving process. We talked about this just briefly. As the leader is retiring, it's smart to give everyone an opportunity to write a note or say what they really, give them, that's grief, right? Giving them grieving. What are funerals? Funerals are grieving. They're moments where you stop and celebrate and you laugh and you cry and you tell stories. And so you need a funeral. They're not dead. But you need a funeral of kinds for leadership to help people grieve. And then, like you do with grief, right? Anniversaries are hard. So a year later, just know people are going through little waves of grief. And so, what can you do to help people think about their grief and process their grief and sit down and say, man, let's... So if you're a part of a board, helping your organization work through grief is huge. Set the stage for how the change is going to trigger that grief. So there's power in just telling people, hey, listen, during this transition, you're going to feel some grief. You're going to feel grief. You're going to feel sad and in denial, and you're going to be bargaining, and you're going to feel anger and depression. And that's grief. That's normal. But here's the thing. We got to know that that's how it's going to feel. And we're not blame anybody for it, but that's how we're going to feel. Like, prepare people to grieve. This is what it's going to feel like, guys. You know, this is really helpful. Just giving people language for what they're feeling is huge. Take on hard changes before the new leader comes in. So if you're a board member, this is really important. If there's stuff that needs to be done that no one wants to do but everyone knows needs to happen, don't put that on the new leader. There's a church I know that hired their new pastor, and as he came in the door, they had a list of like 3 people that he had to fire in his first month. Why? I mean, that board, they knew what needed to be done. They didn't have the courage to do it during the interim, and they set him up to have to use a bunch of equity on day 1 to fire staff members that were going to be a problem. You see, that's terrible. Don't do that. Take those hits as a board. Set things up for success. Set clear expectations and boundaries if there is an overlap. If you're doing this strategy of overlap, the danger here is that people's expectations get out of whack. The incoming leader wants more authority, more leadership, more opportunities sooner than somebody else wants to give it to them. This person strays into this person's lane by accident. Who's doing weddings and funerals, and who runs which meeting, and who speaks into what issues, and who leads this and who leads that, and who talks to who and who reports to who, and all. You got to get that all crystal clear. Like crystal clear. And we all agree to it. We all sign off on it. This is how we're going to interact. This is the plan that leadership's going to transition over the next 2 years. In every 6 months, we're going to have a review of the process. In this quarter of this first half of the year, this is the arrangement. In the second half of the year, these are the responsibilities. They're going to shift. This third part, it's going to be like this. The last part, this is what it's going to look like. These are the expectations. Are we clear? Everybody understands this. Because you're taking away the ambiguity. You can't just trust people to play together. Just throw them in the sandbox. They figure it out, right? You got to have a plan. So the board can do this. Don't leave this up to your leaders to just sit down and have lunch and sort of like figure it out, right? The board can really lead the way to health if you have an overlap. Don't let the honeymoon fool you as a board either. It's fake. Manage change carefully, especially in the first 3 years after you bring in the new leader. You're in the vulnerability window. Organizations can only take so much change. Replacing a heart transplant is a big deal, right? So don't decide to go run a marathon with a brand new, you can't do that, right? So adding a whole lot of change into an organization when you've just gone through a transition is hard. So just manage that, be guarded and careful. And then be ready to support the new leader through the sabotage. Because it's coming, and you need to be committed as a board when it comes. Don't let it surprise you, but when it comes, we're going to lead through this. And we're not going to join the sabotage. We're going to back our leader through the sabotage to the other side. Does that make sense? Okay, and then for a congregation, quickly, and then we're done. Pray. If I haven't said that before, pray. Support, encourage, follow the new leader, give them the credit, assume the best, expect change and frustration, learn to recognize your own grief, no gossiping. Can I say that again? No gossiping. This is a big thing. Gossip is when you talk to anyone who is not the right person to solve the problem, about your problem, right? So if you talk to anybody who can't solve a problem, you're talking to anybody else about your problem, that's gossip, right? You go to the person, if you go to them and they can't deal, then you can bring it to the people who have responsibility over it. You leave it with them, right? You don't go talk about, anyway. No gossip. Release control and expectations, okay? If you're in a congregation or an organization and there's a leadership change, it's not going to feel the same. You can't try to control the process. You're along for the ride. It may be good. It may be bad. You still have your life. You can make all kinds of decisions. You don't have to be a part of it, right? But don't try to control it. That's part of the bargaining thing of grief, right? Control. Release control and expectations. Honor the past and embrace the future. Honor the past and embrace the future. You can do both. Honor the past and embrace the future. And then last thing, eagerly maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Ephesians 4:3. Eagerly maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace.